Hey, everybody. This is number three, right? Number three, social psychology. Interesting stuff, even if psychology isn't your thing. Um, we're just skimming the surface, so to speak. But I think, it gives you a general concept of how psychologists deal with some of the macro aspects of life. Macro meaning, some of the more social society involving groups of people. So, psychology of obedience in particular, we've been looking at compliance, conformity, different theories about that, according to some of the theories that have been proposed by prominent psychologists, is to say. So, social influence in this particular section, looking at social influence. How do groups influence individual members, to make certain decisions, things like that? And keep in mind always, kind of the caveat, so to speak, of all of this, or maybe I should say, the disclaimer, the Surgeon General's warning label on this product. uh, I'm not in any way, shape, or form trying to be an advocate of that which I speak. But part of your general studies requirement involves general studies courses, and one of those is psychology. Sometimes in undergraduate programs, you'll get philosophy, something like that. Sometimes a comparative religions course. Some of the more conjectural type of courses, and this certainly is one of them. So I'm presenting information you get here and there interspersed within the among the information, a bit of my comments here and there, but that's all that they are. What I'm thinking, perhaps to do, we have to finish social psychology. We'll have, I believe, one more in this. So this would be like a fourth part of this. Uh, I think we'll do maybe abnormal psychology, and that might be a few. We're looking at May 21st as being the final day of class and the final exam, which I haven't even begun to think about. So don't panic on that. It'll be something doable and achievable, as has been your other assignments as well. And I do appreciate your tracking along with those and your participation. Um, but I may try to conclude with a couple of sections on maybe a biblical psychology, if that makes sense. Like, how does the Bible speak about various components of humanity, of a human being? How, what's the relationship between the thoughts, the emotions, and the volition aspect of behavior and behavioral change, behavioral modification according to Christian teaching. I think this would be a whole course. This is spiritual formation in essence, or at least a component part of that. But we may just take apart like Romans 12, 1 and 2. And what does it mean to be transformed? Of course, that's different than conform. Don't be, or the Greek there is stop. Stop something that is already in motion. Stop being conformed to this world, or we could translate it, if you find yourself getting pulled into the orbit of the world, don't allow it to do that. So you could translate that negative particle either way there. However, don't the whole idea of conformity, which is what we're talking about here from a psychological point of view, about how one would be conformed, how one obeys a certain impetus to obedience. What is causing you to obey? What is causing you to be conformed or pressed into the mold of this world? And then what is it to what should we aspire to be transformed? What's the means for transformation? It's the renewing of the mind. What does that mean? When he uses the word nous and other things. So that could be a good study, and to try to, of course, it'd have to be pretty brief, but to put forth somewhat of a model. And I probably have enough, I have enough stuff in my little journal and notebook and and whatever, with all kinds of little Hebrew items and Greek items and all that. But it would give us at least somewhat of a model and something if you're heading into pastoral ministry or counseling ministry or anything. Oh God, I'm sure, Brother Schenke, gives ample and quite good foundation for that as well. So what are we doing today? Psychology of obedience. We continue in that. Here, this is somewhat interesting. This Astroten, it sounds very sophisticated, doesn't it? The Astroten study, part 1. Hoeffling and colleagues. So something's going on here, and Hoeffling is a hospital, Hoeffling Hospital, and some colleagues at that hospital in 1966, and you notice Milgram was early 60s, and so you're seeing a lot of social psychologists doing, dare I say, seminal work. And when we say seminal work, we're saying the work to which later psychologists would refer. And we might say that in biblical studies, some seminal work by some theologian. And so my doctoral work, or one of my doctoral projects was to engage in this sort of seminal type of work with regard to spirit baptism and other things of that nature. So we say seminal work. This is kind of one, and these were developed, perhaps we could say, in the early to mid 60s. So here's Hoeffling and colleagues, and there were. This is basically an experiment. We're saying a study, but it was one of those. Who's the researcher? Who's the experimenter? Or involving an experimenter, and then participants. And you would generally have your confederates, those people who are in league with the experimenter or the researcher, but certainly it's unknown to the other participants. In this case, where it says participants were nurses on duty. I can move myself out of the way. Participants were nurses on duty alone in a hospital ward. So there needs to be a little explanation there, because these in this case, 22 nurses, and each one is being presented with the opportunity either conform to the demands of. Remember, we had to have like an authority person in this, so there's going to be the introduction of an authority person who's going to issue a command or a directive, to which this is going to be replicated now in the experiment 22 times. So this is not a group at this point. We're going to talk about group stuff in a moment. This is not a group thing at this point, but it's basically involving, these are all colleagues. So these are all nurses that work together, but they are not going to receive the directive together as a group. This is highly significant at this point, because we know that when you are isolated, which is, by the way, as a tangent, this is what Satan likes to do. He did this with Eve, and he does this with others. He likes to isolate. He wants to get you isolated someplace, and then change the punctuation, I like to say, right? So wherever God puts an exclamation point, Satan puts a question mark. Now, so there is a certain psychology to having to make a decision based on a directive from a person in authority when you're alone, when it's a one-on-one thing, than when it's an entire group, when you sort of can pick up the vibe of the group, and sort of like, and we'll talk about that, groupthink and other types of group psychological dynamics in a moment. So let's call the authority person who is going to telephone, or I shouldn't do that, who is going to telephone the nurse in question individually. So one by one, replicated the same thing, the same command, the same directive to do the same thing to 22 different nurses, so 22 times. and then to measure how will they all respond to this directive. Okay, so what else should you know about this? Astroten. What in the world is Astroten? Never heard of it. So this is basically going to be a placebo medication. And the nurse is going to be asked to administer it. She doesn't know it's a placebo. So basically what they did was they took, the experimenters, they took a bottle, labeled it Astroten nicely and professionally and all that, put it in the, if you will, the dispensary or the cabinet, which the nurse would have access. And no one knows what this is, which is important as well to the study you'll see in a moment. But nevertheless, there's an authoritative person who will identify themselves of all things as Dr. Smith. Well, Dr. Smith is on the phone calling a particular nurse, again, replicated 22 times, calling the nurse in question who doesn't know who he is, except on the phone, he's a doctor. Now, we have to go back pre-HIPAA, pre all this stuff, go all the way back to the 60s, which is, 1966. I'm 6 years old. I'm telling you, that's like so ancient. But you're going all the way back before all of these measures, before people were hypersensitive about, what I should say is people were much more trusting in a phone call from a doctor than today. Who are you? How do we know? You're going to have to prove, and you have to prove your identity, right? All the time. And then you can't even sign on to Amazon or Google or anything. They've got to send you the code, they got to put the code in. Okay, it's you, and all that stuff. So let's just say, for the sake of it, that for the nurse, this is perfectly acceptable, sort of. But she doesn't know him except he calls, and he says, okay, so I want you to administer, what is the dosage? 22 milligrams. I want you to administer 22 milligrams of Astroten to this particular patient. Now, if you don't know what the medication, you don't know that the doctor, number one, but you don't know what the medication is. And I should add to that this medication, like for example, let's say the nurse was going, well, just a minute, doc, just a minute. Let me just see, where is Astroten on the list of authorized medications? It's not there. So all this stuff is going on, right? All this stuff is going on. Now, remember with Milgram, you had the teacher in there and they're shocking somebody. But these people knew that they were involved in an experiment. Oh, it's Yale University, and all this stuff. So the nurses had no concept whatsoever. So they're just basically, this is every day I show up to work. I get a phone call. Oh, it's a doctor. Oh, okay. Yes, sir. Yes. What can I do for you, doctor? Yes, I need you to go to the cabinet, get Astroten. I need you to administer 22 milligrams to this particular patient. In addition, I had to go to several sources because this PowerPoint really doesn't give enough. In addition, the doctor says something like, and she'd say, well, who's authorizing this? I mean, who asked that to a doctor, right? Who's authorizing this? He says, well, of course I am. But what he says is, don't worry. When I come in, I will sign the authorization. But right now, you need to get that medication to that person. I'm just too busy to come in and authorize it now. So here you have a situation where how many, if I ask you, individual, this again replicated 22 times, not just to yourself, of course I can't hear you, right? So to yourself, how many of the 22 do you think? Let's see who gets the closest. You guys can, on Messenger, you can chat back and forth a little bit. How many of the 22 do you think went along with it? Hi. Hoffling Hospital. How may I help you? And it's Dr. Smith. Ooh, Dr. Smith. And so, okay, what do I do? I go, so how many do you think, just based on that phone call and the fact that the medication was not authorized, the two things, the administering of the medication was not authorized. There's no signed authorization, nor was it listed as an approved medication by the hospital. Okay. How many of the, do you think maybe half? Do you think half of those nurses would be that, you know, I don't want to say gullible, pliable, willing, compliant? How many? Do you think only a third? You know, probably a third, you know, because these are well-trained professional nursing staff. 21 out of 22. Really. 21 out of 22. And we'll see something on the next slide in a moment. But so here's this medication, right? And you should know, I don't know that this is a medication. I found a picture of some pills, but so 3 rules of the hospital, I can tell you that these nurses knew very, very well. One, that medication orders need to be given in person, never over the phone. Rule 1. Rule 2, according to the label, this was an overdose. Clearly an overdose. Maybe 10 milligrams wasn't, he's saying 22. 3, the medication was unauthorized. So those, I'm thinking, if you broke one of the rules, any one of those rules, yeah, hey, it's just an overdose. What's the big deal there? Or so what if the guy's calling, you know, and I don't know him? Can you imagine? So what in fact happened? Okay, part of the experiment that the nurses did not know, that they were not privy to this, was that they would be intercepted before they actually administered it, which is gracious, because if you found out later, I mean, and that they would have to then live with the fact that they knowingly administered a potentially fatal overdose to, you know, well, I say potentially fatal. We don't know, but they said it's a dangerous drug. You know, it could have been fatal, but they were intercepted. You know, but what would you feel like? I mean, this is another, you know, psychological part of this whole thing, right? So what would you feel like if you were that nurse, and it's almost like boom, you know, caught? I don't know how much was revealed to them, except maybe they were just intercepted, but, you know, and said, okay, don't do it. I mean, what would you think? That's it. I'm going to lose my job. You know, it's almost like a sting that was performed, except it was an experiment. So what you should grab from this is that it's we mentioned the other experiment being one that everyone knew, Milgram, that everybody knew. You know, I'm participating in an experiment. This one is what we call a naturalistic field experiment. Remember about observation? We looked at researchers in the past. You know, there's data-driven, informational type of various datum points that we can gather all together and make conclusions. And then we said about observation, that you can be observing and in the room where everybody knows, and then you can just be sort of like, you know, looking through the window or observing on cameras or something like that. This is naturalistic. So this is that naturalistic kind where you're seeing how people behave uninterrupted in a normal, you know, kind of work experience here. So one of the published conclusions, so to speak, paraphrasing it, people are unwilling to question supposed authority, though when other nurses were asked hypothetically, 21 out of 22 said they would not comply. In other words, what that means is that one-on-one in a naturalistic setting, when it's actual real life and the pressure's on, 21 out of 22 comply. But take the same group and put them in a situation where you're sitting in a classroom and let's say you're the trainer, and you're part of the hospital administration. You have the nursing staff together and says, okay, let's be clear. Let's be clear about three rules of this hospital. If somebody calls in, it's never. You always administer the dosage, only 3 if that medication is on the approved list. That's it. Okay. So how many of you, if somebody called in, how many of you would go ahead and do it? And of course, and so you just flip the results. So 21 out of 22. And I think the next slide here, the separate sample of 33 nurses. This is just another example where 33 said that in theory, in theory versus reality, only 2 said they would not obey only 2 said they would not obey. They would resist the doctor's orders. So I jotted down just a few things off the top of my head that may give us a little bit of backdrop specific to, let's call it the social context a little bit. Let's just make up something. One would be the presence of an authority, in this case, a doctor. So this should raise the cultural impropriety of questioning someone far removed from our knowledge and expertise, even for a nurse. Now, that for a nurse to question a doctor, it's just not done ever. And this can be a good thing. This can be a bad thing. But think about a situation where you're in a position where it's a mismatch. Okay, you can find yourself that way a lot of times in a classroom, like if you're with an academic, who's got multiple doctorates or something, and then a particular subject comes up, and you want to question, you want to fact check. It's just not that you have an opinion that differs from your professor or someone, or if you're reading a book. And you look, it's some PhD who certainly knows more than I do. Who am I to question this? But so you might think that your opinion is invalidated because your knowledge base is so much less. And yet facts are facts. And you might obviously be able to point out that your factual evidence is inconsistent with your conclusions. And easily point that out. I don't care how smart the guy is. You could easily, point that out. But yet you would feel somewhat diminished or powerless to do that, thinking, wow, I'm just going to be embarrassed in the process. Or in this particular case, I could lose my job. A second thing, the social situation of a patient in need of treatment. So now you add the authority of the doctor in a hospital setting, even if it's on a phone call. Maybe the need of the patient, I'm suggesting now, suddenly trumps all of the policy, the 3 policies, the 3 rules of the hospital. Well, it's an emergency. Now be very, very careful, because there's what my wife and I will call the tyranny of the urgent. And that is because we've dealt with people, all of our lives publicly. So some people will try to create a situation that's so urgent that it must compel you to act and set aside all judgment and all reason and all your sort of gut instinct and all those things, and especially the rules that are in front of you. 3, the sworn duty of a nurse as a medical practitioner to help people. And what about that? Well, that's what I'm supposed to do. That's why I got into the nursing profession. 4, the consensus, I can't read my own writing. The consequences for not following a doctor. Again, could I lose my job? Something like that. So I just want to give us a sense with these kind of simple. Let me just get the nurse and the doctor here, right? It's a classical mismatch, right? You've got the authority person, you have a qualified, well-trained practitioner, and so the idea is he must know something more than I do, because he also knows that it wouldn't be appropriate to do these things. Therefore, listen, I'll tell you, there are a lot of other situations, where whether it's male and female dynamic, especially, it's been highlighted in our society now for quite a few years, exposing a lot of celebrities and politicians and famous people. Why? Because these are people of power that tried to use their position of authority to influence the behavior or compel the compliance or conformity of a female, right? And so we see this. And the female feeling powerless and what else can I do yields something, right? And only now many are given a voice, and some are taking advantage of that. But some, it's genuine. So I'm saying that even though we're not talking about that specifically here, the psychology is very similar. So what I'm telling you all is be careful of what you might say you would do in a group situation and how that might differ from what you actually do or have done in a individual situation. And those we've seen are radically different. So let's do another one, and let's move Doug somewhere. Let's move Doug down here. So let's talk about the Jonestown Massacre. So we're moving a bit from the individuated situation, one person, one authority, that type of thing, to a more group dynamic now. This is just tea. Don't worry about it. Do you see? Hope, everybody. Hope. So everything's Huskies, where we are, right? Everything's Huskies, but at Hope Chapel, everything is hope forever. Okay, that was our commercial. Jonestown. This was I'm telling you, incredible. So I've had a few interesting days in my life, that is in connection with global events, and this was one of them. 1978. Jim Jones, Reverend Jim Jones, he was your quintessential, atypical, stereotypical, let's say, maybe almost the progenitor of the, all the televangelists today and things of this nature. He wasn't per se a televangelist, but he was one of these charismatic type of individuals. Sort of started out in a, I don't want to use the term fundamentalistic, but more of a traditional pastor congregation, this type of thing. Really, he was a real student of social psychology, and how he could control masses and how he could compel others against their will, really to, well, I say against their will, but how he could convince people to bend their will to his thing. I mean, obviously, if you could see hundreds of people choosing to drink poison to take their life, that's pretty powerful, right? So it wasn't like one day, he just came out and said, hey, you know what? I think it'd just be great if we all just, killed ourselves today. No. So that this had a trail. And so we look at that just a little bit. But there's the high point, I should say, is the Jonestown Massacre. And this was in Jonestown, Guyana. Jim Jones, there's no, Jim Jones had built up much of his ministry. Much of what he was doing in the United States, I believe on the West Coast, San Francisco. Well, he got in trouble with, I want to say the IRS and other government agencies, that he came under their surveillance. So he ends up moving to Guyana, which is Guyana, South America. established this Jonestown and this whole kind of cult community there. Cult simply by definition because they have lost the ability to exercise their own independent will. They have all just yielded complete control to this leader. That's a cult, right? So they end up when basically we had members of, I believe they were congressmen, a whole team that actually flew there to observe what was going on. They end up being killed, and or for the most part, I think one escaped, and others, it was a bloodbath, and some 800, 900 people drank the cyanide Kool-Aid. So, you'll hear the expression today, like someone who, like you or like me, who may be a follower of Jesus, and and other people might say, "Oh, so you drink the Kool-Aid, huh?" Or anybody, some atheists will say that about anybody who's religious in nature. "Oh, so you drink the Kool-Aid," which means you have no mind of your own. You're just fully compliant with whatever your religion tells you to do. This type of thing. It's a reference back here to Jim Jones and Guyana. So he's using a various amount of these types of control or crowd control, group think types of things. So this was at this time, this was me. This is what I looked like on the right, and I was a student here at University of SUNY Delhi. You see, this is just half or 2/3 of the way from where I live now, heading down towards Binghamton. And, just one of those small campuses in the mountains. And this was me in 1978. Then here's Jim Jones. So you get an idea of what Jones's appearance is. And here is the group. So a tent location, you see the fence there around the compound, and these are all, tents that people would live in, and some roadways and power lines. Almost looks like a fairgrounds, doesn't it? This was obviously some way to line people up while they were coming in and out of this place where he would hold meetings or they would eat or things like that. But this was the scene, after when they had drank the poison and concluded their lives. So just to maybe talk about what types of techniques were used there. So one would be this foot in the door technique, where Jones was able to increase the financial support required of each member until they had turned over essentially everything they owned. Remember that, kind of the foot of the door is you get a sequence of yes, 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 starting with, the lowest level of pain, then to the highest level of investment. Get up. And when I did sales, 100 years ago, was trained in that. It was, that you ask people questions that the answers are yes. And then you can, if you want to close the deal, you go back to the beginning and review with them. All right, so we've decided that this product is valuable to you. We've decided that something, and then you bring them up to the point where they're almost embarrassed at this point to say no. And that's why, if you get locking horns with a hard pressing, hard driving salesman, you stop them soon and just say, no, I'm not agreeing with that at this point. So anyway, Jones then had he had recruiters ask people walking by to help the poor, and when they refused, the recruiters then asked them to donate 5 minutes of time. Now, this wasn't in South America. I'm going to say, how did he build up this thing? So he's looking for, people to do something that he knows they won't do. So this is like the first one's the foot in the door. This is the door in the face, the door in the face one, which is I'm going to ask you to do something that I know is so repugnant that I'm going to come back then with a much lesser task that you're most likely to, it's sort of like somebody approaches you and says, listen, I'd like you to donate $100 to help in. Whoa, hey, what do you think I mean? Well, but then they said, well, hey, I'll tell you what, even $10, even $5 even would help. When your goal anyway was the $5, and so he'd ask him to come back and, hey, could you just give me 5 minutes to put some letters in envelopes? But see, what he's doing is he's starting to, you're starting to condition people to do things for them. And the next to be just a little bit more. And then informational social science, the last one, which we might, say informational social influence, was also being moved from San Francisco. So the social influence, when the social context turns a bitter, difficult, adversarial, counterproductive to Jones and his mind control thing, we got to get these people out of here. Let's get them to some rural place where they're, where they're vulnerable. Let's get them to Guyana, South America. And the key there, to look to others to guide themselves. So I'd suggest this. I put like 5 little follow-ups to this. One, from the individual's point of view, I want to be certain about my life, about my situation. 2, these circumstances yield uncertainty. For example, why you remove them from the familiar place of San Francisco to a place fraught with uncertainty. Where what are we going to do? How are we going to live? Who's going to feed us? Who's going to take care of us? So on and so forth. So the person psychologically wants to have certainty. Now they're in a situation where social influence is just full of uncertainty. 3, someone with certainty is present. Enter Jim Jones. So I've got the answers. I'm going to take care of you. I'll be your father. Look to me. And then 4, I'm in a vulnerable situation here. And 5, so I really have no other recourse. Where can I go? What can I do? Who's going to take care of me? He says he will. If I just rely on him, as he says I can, that'll remove all I will then have the certainty that I need, so on and whatever. And that's your basic, mind control. Let's move Doug over here. So how groups influence us. Let's look at this a little bit. And we want to take this apart in this fashion, as quick as we can. Social facilitation, social loafing, why it has 2 thes, I don't know. The diffusion of responsibility, bystanding effect, de-individuation, and group polarization. So social facilitation. And what we do, I suppose what we do most easily, most quickly, when a stimulus is present. So facilitation of dominant response on a task due to social arousal. What do you do when a stimulus is present? What do you default? That's social facilitation. What's your default action when there's some type of a stimulus present? And then let me try to say this in another way. Because the second bullet point leads to improvement on simple or well-learned tasks and worse performance on complex or unlearned tasks when others are present. Let's say this in other words. Basically, if you are a poor performer at something, it's not your thing. It's not your skill set. Adding, there's going to be a difference between how you perform that poorly as an individual. But what's the social facilitation? Add a crowd to that. Are you going to improve or are you going to do worse? So what's the crowd effect? what the crowd being the stimulus, um, apply stress. So sometimes we use the expression, pressure makes diamonds, and I think in some sense it does. We need pressure um, to achieve good. I think pressure will take good performance and make it better if you have the skill set. Pressure will take good performance and make it better. But if you try to add pressure to someone who does not have the basic skill, you'll destroy them. They just crack under the pressure. And that's kind of the idea of what's being said here, positively, negatively, in terms of social facilitation. So a basketball player shooting, let's just move to this, right? So here is whether I'm going to put Doug right in the middle. So here is on the left-hand side, a very, very young Rick Barry. And you notice here's a very, very young grandson of his. Both were in the same number. Okay. Rick Barry was known for, shooting the, free throws. He would shoot, I want to say 93% of his free throws, maybe higher. He was perennially the NBA leader in not scoring, but in free throw accuracy. Rick Barry, right? So this is his grandson who is now trying to, introduce this method once again. But free throws. Let's say that this is your skill set. You're proficient in this. Okay. One-on-one, and I can remember my record was like 98 out of 100. I'm not kidding. So let me tell you the setup. I had at the house when I was a kid. I had your typical basket on the garage. It was pretty good. It was a backboard that was mounted and pretty good setup. Little blacktop driveway thing. We used to have all the neighbors come over and we play pickup ball. It was like the center of the community. And we had the floodlights at night, so everybody's playing. So it was a 2-car garage, and right in the middle, was this thing. So if I sit there at the foul line and I could, shoot, and if I swished it through, it would hit that thing and bounce right back to me. And I just kept going like that, boom, 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 like this. And, I don't think I'd do 98 out of 100 if I had to have my brother or somebody else there who would catch it, and throw it back to me. And maybe it'd go over here, it'd go over here. But the fact that I could continue to just keep that sort of same rhythm. But I remember this specifically. I was probably 15, 16 years old, 98 out of 100. But if you're proficient, that's what you do. That's your skill. Pressure is only going to make good performance better. But if you've never picked up a basketball in your life, I don't care how much pressure you apply to that person, it's only going to make bad performance worse. So just keep that in mind. That's my illustration of that. Now, how about social loafing? Let's see what we have for this. Okay, it occurs when people pool their efforts to achieve a common goal. And so it means like if we have one goal and we only have one person to do it, okay, there's not going to be a whole lot of loafing there. But imagine if you have a class of 20 students and you say, okay, we're all going to do this project. If you only have 2 students now, what do you think the workload is going to be? But if it's the same project now spread instead of over 2, but over 20, any candidates for a loafer? Any loafers going to be in that group? And so you're probably going to find that's, look at the second bullet point, the tendency for people to exert less effort when working toward a common goal in a group than when individually accountable. That's really technical academic speak for what I just said, right? The diffusion of responsibility is the principle, basically. What you get is social loafing. How that occurs is because it's been diffused, like diffused light spreads, or concentrated light is a beam. So it occurs in responsibility for it to spread across, a number of people. So any loafers in this room, there you go. Someone looks like, what is going on? This guy, I have no clue. He's taking a nap. She is a little overexcited with her numbers. Okay, now how groups influence us continue. So we have the bystander effect, which is another interesting thing. It posits, and we've talked about this before. It posits the probability of a person's helping in an emergency is greater when there are no other bystanders. If it's just you observing something and that nobody else is observing it, then the likelihood that you're going to jump in and help is greater than if it's a whole host of people. Remember the Kitty Genovese? I think we talked about it at some point, in the course. This woman that was, kind of savagely murdered. Oh, it says right there, Kitty Genovese, 1964 murder. Okay. And so the idea was that there was, 37, 38 bystanders who could see each other and not calling. This is a picture of the young Kitty Genovese. So it's, and I don't know what the paper is here, for more than half an hour. 38 respectable law-abiding citizens in Queens watched a killer stalk and stab in 3 separate attacks in Kew Gardens. So this is the bystander effect. Yeah, some other attempts to confirm, suspicions about bystanders and the bystander effect. We have here John Darley and Bibb, I believe is the name, Bibb, Latine. Again, this is in the 60s. They're psychologists. They formulated basically this bystander effect. And then you sort of read that back to what happened to Kitty. Well, that must have been the bystander effect. But here, they attempted to do it. And then they did it with college students, that here was a round-robin discussion where ostensibly the students were brought in to discuss how you adjust into college life. Maybe they were freshmen, something like that. Or problems over, it says here, problems over the intercom system. Suddenly one student, which was the Confederate, starts having a seizure, cries out for help, and participant willingness to help depended on how many other individuals the participant thought were able to help the student having the seizure. So, I mean, why this is happening that way? Can we explain it? Are people more likely to help is the research question if there's a bunch of other people around. And so you have the priest and the Levite and the injured Samaritan, right? Just going by. I don't know. This one guy in the middle is like, I believe he's looking at the guy taking the picture, not down here. Not sure what's going on. People seem rather willing to walk by. Yeah. So Latine and Darley did a couple notes here on this. So they create a situation to try to change sort of the context, but keep the same variables of the Kitty Genovese situation. So they recruited college students to produce what seemed to be an innocent talk with other college. Each participant was given headphones and a microphone, and they stayed alone in a room talking to other students, but through the intercom. And according to researchers, this was done to protect everyone's anonymity. So you have to say, well, okay, they were it's sort of a group dynamic, but they were individuated in that they had headphones and things like that, and interacted through intercom. So that's part of it. Are you just in the room together, or is there some other form of interaction through a window, over the telephone, and this way an intercom. So the first group thought that they were talking one-on-one with the other person. The second group thought they were talking with two other people. The third group thought that they were talking in a group of five. And at a certain point in the conversation, a person in the intercom stated or started acting as if they were having some type of seizure, some type of problem. So how did the people that thought they were in a one-on-one conversation with the person having a seizure react versus the one that thought that there were multiple people in on this communication? So when participants thought there were only, it was a one-on-one thing, 85% of them left the room to find assistance. When the participant thought that there were just two other bystanders, not 38, but two other bystanders, the number dropped to 64%. And in a situation with four bystanders, just four, not 38, it dropped to 31% of the participants. So one takeaway from that would be, well, okay, but maybe the number of people around you influences the likelihood of giving assistance. But if it were the participants' own lives that were at risk, I'm sure everybody would do something regardless. So they set up, what if it's the people, everybody in the quote unquote experiment, what if it's their lives? Then certainly everybody's going to rush to help, right? So they set up a second experiment. In the second experiment, Latané and Darley once again recruited college students. This time it was, fill out a questionnaire, and they divided the participants into two groups. Participants filling out the questionnaire alone in a room, and then participants filling out the questionnaire with many Confederates in the room who were also filling out the questionnaire. So first of all, you're alone in a room, then there's others with more people. A few minutes after the participants start the task, a black smoke starts to creep out from the room's air conditioner, and it gets thicker and thicker until the room is filled with smoke. However, in the second group, the Confederates were instructed to ignore the smoke and no one. So you have, of the participants who were alone, 75% left the room and reported the smoke. The people alone left the room, reported the smoke. But believe it or not, with all those Confederates in there kind of ignoring it, only 10% left the room. 10% of the actual participants left the room. So it's a surprising result, but the greater number of bystanders equals the less likely we are to act. So this was studied out pretty vigorously. There's our KKK burning cross and hood. This is a example of de-individuation. So in a group setting, another powerful influence is to sort of take away your individuality. Okay, so what do? Do we give you all the same uniform? Do we, in some settings, that's how the military operates, right? Because we have to function as a unit function. So I'm not suggesting it's always has a negative connotation, but in this case, it's extremely harmful, right? So the uniform of Ku Klux Klan members, especially the hood, fosters de-individuation. So on the part of the person. So he's right. I have a certain amount of anonymity. I used to have that in the first bullet point. Anonymity. Nobody knows who I am. So how will you act if no one knows who you are? If you can't be recognized? Will you act differently in a group setting? Will that socially influence you? So this has to do with loss of self-awareness, and with the loss of self-awareness, then perhaps there's a corresponding loss of self-restraint. A person may act entirely different. He may not be as restrained as he would as everybody knows who he is and can identify him or her. Feelings of less restraint and enable people to forget their moral values and just act spontaneously with the other group members. Is what we see here. How about group group polarization. So this involves strengthening of a group's prevailing opinion about a topic following group discussion of that topic. So you're in a group setting, some particular topic is being discussed, and you sort of want to be part of the consensus position. Maybe you're feeling out the vibe and you just kind of join in with that. Now think about that. If a certain group wants to initiate you and you come in, you have this strong sense of wanting to fit in. You know, I want to go along to get along type of thing. What are you willing to surrender? This happens, by the way, when perhaps you take a job and you're asked to do something that's unethical, and you are like, well, I took this job, I'm this and this, and if I stand my ground, but this is what's called normative social influence, or what we would call, let's just call it peer pressure. You conform to what other people are doing to be accepted, to avoid social ridicule. I want to be accepted. That's a big one. And be careful about that. Just be very, very careful. Two fundamental aspects of the human condition. We want to be loved. We want to be accepted, loved and accepted. What will you do to be loved and accepted, right? And this can be an emotional kind of fulcrum, something that is a tipping point, a turning point in your life. It just can be used. I need to be loved. What will I do to be loved? What do I do to earn love, or something like that, or favor? Or what do I do I don't want people ridiculing me. I want everybody to like me. These are powerful things, psychologically. So we have things like group polarization and groupthink, group polarization and group think, right? So group polarization being the mode of group thinking that impairs this decision. Did we get to group polarization? No. This is what we're talking about here. This idea of polarized, the idea I'm either accepted or I'm not accepted. I'm ridiculed or I'm not ridiculed. But the group think, a mode of group thinking that impairs decision making, your decision making, occurs when the desire for group harmony overrides a realistic appraisal of possible decisions. I've just sort of lumped in with everybody else. Group members, they refrain from expressing maybe concerns that they might have, doubts, judgments, or disagreements with the consensus position. You all of a sudden just go silent, and that's related to the polarization question. So you would have to value harmony. It's not that you value harmony above disharmony, but what you're doing is you're suspending rational judgment in this sense. You don't have to create disharmony to introduce rational judgment. And so you can just ignore the moral and ethical consequences, in the heat of the moment, all in the name of groupthink. So here's just some crazy little cartoon, right? So we need more dissenting opinions. I agree, right? Now, there's the Challenger explosion, which this was some many years ago in the Reagan administration. So we're going back, 30, long time. And this is a space shuttle Challenger, and you see it taking off on the right. Another space shuttle mission. As I grew up in the Apollo age, well, actually the Gemini age, and became the Apollo age, and it was typical for us to be able to watch the launches of these rockets, that went from Cape Canaveral and Cape Kennedy. Name change, back and forth. And then it became the launch of the space shuttle. I can remember towards the end of the space shuttle, I was near Dallas-Fort Worth Airport. I think I just arrived. Been picked up, get back out onto the main route, heading into downtown Dallas. We just got outside the airport precincts, and I vehicles, all these vehicles pulling off the side of the road. What's going on? Why is everybody pulling off? Why is everybody have video cameras and everything else? And so we pulled off, and this massive shadow just came over the road, and it was a space shuttle. Space shuttle. And the thing is, with the shuttle, they never announced. They never announced. So I don't know how these people knew, but could have possibly seen it off in the distance, but they never announced where they were coming in. And so I think it was huge, I'll tell you. But then on the left, blowing up. So what's the deal with groupthink? I mean, it's a tremendous loss of life of the astronauts. So groupthink, in this particular case, just had to do with the prevailing condition prior to launch. Now, I can remember the whole rockets, going up years ago, and back in the late 60s, early 70s, when the Apollo missions were going up. And you get to this point where it'd say T minus. In other words, the time to launch, they'd say T minus 2 minutes and counting. And it was, we'd sit there in front of the television and watch, especially early on. I remember when we landed on the moon. I remember watching Neil Armstrong at that point on black and white, console TV. But you'd get this T minus, and then you as kids, you'd count it down 10, 9, 8. But they would actually start with days. Get down to hours on this T minus. So you didn't pay attention. It was T minus 30, and after a while, you just got accustomed to the fact that they would stop the countdown. Just stop it. And it might be frozen there for 2 days because of some problem. And then it would just, start it back up again. And you were never sure, it'd get down to T minus 2 minutes and whatever. And you think, oh, yeah, maybe not, maybe not, it wasn't just a straight countdown. Well, here's a similar situation. There were engineers that said, "No, you've got to wait. There's problems with the seals, and the seals on the shuttle itself, the seals on the rocket segments. More likely in this case, sometimes it was tiles. Some of the tiles on the shuttle that have been previously damaged, repaired." And it could be anything, absolutely anything, and you have to stop it. But for whatever reason, they didn't stop it. It was all, they attributed this to just groupthink. Just come on. You just got a couple of dissenters there. Come on, push it forward. And as a result, you could go back to the Pearl Harbor disaster, and it was a similar groupthink. And you get tons of these groupthink types of examples. Doug again. Now, what about attributions? What are these things? Process by which people explain their own behavior. So to what do we attribute this? My behavior, someone else's behavior. For example, someone trips and falls. Oh, wow, but we might think in some situation. And we see this happening, and we're standing there and we observe it. So if it's a matter of, I'll just go here, if it's a matter of internal attribution, then we're going to attribute it to that person's disposition or personal characteristics. What was wrong with that guy that he did that? Can he read? Caution, whatever. Can he read? Or an external attribution involves explaining behavior in terms of a person's circumstance. And so, this was a wet floor. That's why, so we don't refer to the person. So when we see particular behavior psychologically, do we attribute it to it's that internal external thing, like we talked about before with personalities. It's that internal external thing. So how do we attribute? And that's what we talk about with attribution, basically. Let's move me down over here again. So there's what is called with this then a fundamental attribution error. The observer tends to overestimate internal dispositional influences and underestimate external situational influences. Like overestimating internal dispositional influences. Somebody's naive, somebody's foolish, something like that, and to underestimate the external situational. So the external, like weather or slippery roads, something like that. That's an attributional error. So, for example, so would this be a fundamental attribution error to overestimate the internal dispositional influences, right? So could you possibly, in the case on the left-hand side, be overestimating in any way, shape, or form how naive and foolish this infant is by what the infant is doing? No. So you'd say this is perfectly consistent and reasonable, but an infant may try to do this. This is, by the way, a European household, as you can tell by the prongs and the outlets. But on the contrary, on the right-hand side, would it be possible to underestimate the external situational influences? And so on the left-hand side, it says, no, I think we got that about right. But you could see a case. You could see a case, though, if we put a different picture up there where that fundamental attribution error might occur there. But on the right-hand side, we'd say, sure, somebody could, and people do, right? People do. Just driving this past winter, to Pottersville from my location, cutting across Route 29 and up 87, and how many people, especially at 6 o'clock in the morning when the roads are like this, although it's darker, and people are off the road, they're driving too fast, and they underestimate the conditions. Well, that is what's called a fundamental attribution error. So I'm sure the next time you see someone in the ditch on the side of the road, you might just tell them that exactly what that is. It is a fundamental attribution error. In particular, it is an external attribution. They will be so impressed to hear you say that. So how about attributions for behavior of others if we're talking in terms of just world, not just the world, but just world. Think in terms of justice, just world hypothesis. Observer places blame on victims by assuming that the world is just and that people get what they deserve. In some Eastern countries, it'd be like karma, right? Cause and effect type of thing. You do something bad happens to you, something like that. They might think, but this can be, folks that think in a very judicial sense that, you're going to get what you deserve, someday or something like that, or something bad, negative happens, and it must be the consequence of some bad thing that you have previously done. So there's the just world hypothesis. There's the primacy effect, partially responsible for the fundamental attribution error, occurs when early information is weighted more heavily than later information. All right, so what does all that break down in less academic speak? The primacy effect has to do with first impressions, really. That your first thoughts about something, how in the world do those ever get mitigated or erased, or they just stay with you forever? Do you ever know someone that you've met and you just put a bad taste in your mouth? Maybe somebody planted a little bit in there in your mind, and you didn't have a good exchange with them, and it's hard to come back from that, depending on how bad the first impression was. So primacy, meaning my first impression of you is going to kind of remain unless something really, 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 really radical happens, to upset that. So I'm thinking about the case of Job, in terms of the just world hypothesis, because the case of Job. He had his so-called friends, and yet they were all saying, "Come on, Job." Even his wife over here, saying, "Just curse God and get it over with," because if you curse God, He'll just kill you. So, Job, your life is so pitiful. You might as well. You have no future. You're just dying a slow death. So just get it over with. Curse God, and the lightning bolt will come down and incinerate you. But his friends are just tormenting him with this. Just admit it. Just admit it. We live in a just world, Job. Just admit what you have done. Come clean before God. Primacy effect. You talk about you know um, first impressions. And this is just a simple, diagram about that. People go in for a job interview, 67% fail to make eye contact, 47% have little knowledge of the company. They don't smile. They have bad posture. Maybe they have bad breath too. And statistics show that first impressions are determined by 55% the way you dress and act and walk through the door, the quality of your voice, your tonal quality, how you speak, your grammar, the confidence that you exude, the words you choose to say. Okay, so think about that. If you want to come off all, there's a right place to use certain terminology, and then there's a wrong place. I'm not talking about bad words. I'm just saying, pretty advanced, high vocabulary. So if you're looking to become a professor, and be hired by an academic dean, that might be good to use that. But if not, you're just going to annoy people and come off all knowing, that type of thing. So I don't know. Given the context, trust is built on first impressions. You could take this two different ways, right? So the guy on the right is the same as the guy on the left. In a medical situation, a professional situation, if you're going to a doctor and he looks like the guy on the right, I'm thinking your next question is, excuse me, how can I get out of here? Where is the exit? Or not on your life, mister. So, but if you're going into the inner city, and we could easily change this to, you're going to preach to a street gang in the inner city, and you're going to talk to them. And instead of the medical garb, it's a three-piece suit. You think that's going to make out, or the guy on the right? I think the guy on the right is going to make out a lot better. He's going to be much more identifiable. He's got the sleeves, even though his shirt doesn't have sleeves. He's got the tats on there, right? So let's talk about self-fulfilling prophecy. That's a fairly common one. Occurs when expectations of a person elicit behavior from the person that confirms our expectation. That's clear. That's clear as mud. So if you think a person's uncooperative, for example, then you might, if you think they are, somebody maybe put that in your head, and you think they're uncooperative, then you may act in an uncooperative way in your interactions with that person. And just change the uncooperative to, if you have been told that a person, imagine a situation, you've been told that person doesn't like you, or that person said some stuff about you, or that person is angry with you. How is that going to affect the way you approach that person? It may affect them in the same point that you may make them angry at you because of the way you act. And that's kind of the notion behind a self-fulfilling prophecy. To put it in terms like this. So thoughts and beliefs in your head, influence your attitude, that influence your actions, that influence your outcomes, and so on. And it just spins around. Now, this is just one model based on the subject, the person, but the object. And we could intersperse this a little bit more complicated model and add, how does that affect the other person? The other person, that exchange. So your preconceptions of them will affect their observations of you, which may in fact confirm. But the only reason it's confirming your thoughts and beliefs is because you have the wrong idea about them, or could have the wrong idea about them. So I think this is an interesting one. So how about the actor-observer bias, tendency to attribute personal behavior to situational influences, or let me get my cursor back here. Tendency to attribute the behavior of others to dispositional influence. So as actors, our our attention is focused on the situation, but as observers, our attention is focused on the individual. So as actors, the tendency is to attribute personal behavior, me in that situation. But as observers, then we're focused more on the individual. Here, here's the Linus and Lucy. So why are you always so anxious to criticize me? I just think I have a knack for seeing other people's faults. What about your own faults? I have a knack for overlooking them. So when we observe, no, we certainly see the faults, but when it's us, no. Then the self-serving bias, tendency to overestimate dispositional influences. There's a tendency to make attributions so that one can perceive oneself favorably. In other words, we take credit for our success, but not for our failure. It's hard for you to get this out of here. The difference between, for example, in the educational system, 1960 and 2010, 50 years, these grades are terrible, and the fault is on the child, and in 2010, these grades are terrible, the fault is on the teacher. So that's a self-serving bias. We take credit for our successes, but not for our failures. Then we get this false consensus effect and false uniqueness effect. So self-service bias can also influence our estimates on the extent to which other people think and act of us. So the false consensus effect, the tendency to overestimate the commonality of one's opinions and unsuccessful behaviors. And the false uniqueness effect, the tendency to underestimate the commonality of one's abilities and successful behaviors. So with the false consensus effect, if you like a certain type of food, for example, you overestimate how many people also like that type of food, the false consensus. Just because you like it, must be everybody likes it. Or if you failed an important exam, you overestimate the number of your classmates who, well, if I failed it, it must be a whole bunch of other people did poorly on it as well. The false uniqueness effect, if you are a good golfer, then you false uniqueness. You think, certainly, if I'm a good golfer, there must be only just a few people who are a good golfer as well, something like that. So we finish with this scene here of a fella who is eyeing his next putt. Okay, so we'll finish out social psychology next time.